Poison silence at Briarcombe Orchard. A Miss Marple mystery. Settle in, dear listener, and allow me to take you to a place where abundance once promised comfort, and where silence now carries a sharper edge. Briarcombe Orchard lies just beyond the low stone walls of its village, neat rows of apple trees stretching toward the horizon like careful handwriting across the land. For generations it has been a place of honest work and predictable seasons, blossoms in spring, harvest in autumn, and a steady rhythm of life that asks very little of those who depend upon it. Until, one morning, the orchard falls quiet. The apples hang untouched, the workers do not arrive, and beneath one of the oldest trees a body is discovered, peaceful in appearance, untouched by violence, yet unmistakably dead. The village insists it was natural. Heat, perhaps. A weak heart. After all, there are no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no raised voices remembered from the day before. Briarcombe prefers explanations that require no disruption. But Miss Jane Marple, arriving later that afternoon with a basket on her arm and curiosity in her eyes, notices what others overlook. She notices the untouched apples near the body. She notices the sudden reluctance to speak of orchard practices. And she notices how quickly certain names are avoided in conversation. Poison does not announce itself. It waits. It blends. It works quietly, much like resentment, fear, and long-kept secrets. Miss Marple understands this better than most, for villages, like orchards, rely on balance. When that balance is disturbed, when something harmful is introduced into the soil, it does not affect one tree alone. It spreads. And as Miss Marple listens to the polite reassurances offered by Briarcombe's residents, she becomes certain of one thing. This death did not come from the trees. It came from the silence beneath them. The apple beneath the tree. Briarcombe Orchard was at its most beautiful in early autumn. The apples hung heavy on the branches, red and gold catching the pale sunlight. The air scented faintly with fruit and earth. Normally the place would have been alive with movement, ladders scraping bark, baskets filling, voices calling across the rows. But on the morning Thomas Hensley was found dead, the orchard was silent. Too silent. The boy who discovered him stood frozen beneath the oldest tree at the edge of the field, his basket abandoned at his feet. Thomas Hensley lay on his back, hands folded loosely at his sides, his cap tipped over one eye, as though he had simply lain down to rest. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned ladder, no bruising, no broken branches. The apples above him remained untouched, swaying gently in the breeze. By the time the village gathered, the explanation had already formed. "He wasn't a young man," Mrs. Carter said firmly. "The heat yesterday was dreadful," added another. "He worked too hard," someone concluded, with the satisfaction of closure. Miss Jane Marple arrived as these judgments were being passed. She stepped carefully between the trees, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the soft soil. She listened without interrupting, her expression mild, almost detached. Only her eyes moved, taking in the details others dismissed. Thomas Hensley's lips were faintly blue. Miss Marple noticed at once. She bent slightly, peering closer, and saw the faint discoloration around his mouth, subtle but unmistakable. His face was calm, but his skin had a waxy pallor that sat uneasily with the notion of sudden natural collapse. "You see," the village constable was saying, "no sign of violence." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Violence is rarely neat." The constable looked at her uncertainly. "I beg your pardon, miss?" Miss Marple gestured toward the ground beside the body. "He was harvesting apples, was he not?" "Yes," the boy said shakily. "He always started early." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "his basket is empty." The villagers glanced at one another. "He must not have begun yet," Mrs. Carter said quickly. Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze drifted upward to a low-hanging branch above Thomas Hensley's head. One apple lay directly beneath it, unblemished, its skin broken only by a single bite mark. Miss Marple crouched and examined it. The bite had not been finished. "That's odd," she murmured. "People don't usually stop halfway through a good apple," she added pleasantly. The orchard owner, Mr. Edwin Blakely, cleared his throat. "Perhaps he felt unwell." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. But she did not put the apple down. She lifted it closer to her face, not to smell, but to observe. The flesh near the bite was slightly darkened, as though bruised from within rather than without. Miss Marple straightened. "Was anything sprayed here recently?" she asked. Blakely stiffened. "Only the usual treatments." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "And who prepares them?" "My nephew," Blakely replied. "Samuel. He handles the chemicals." "And where is Samuel now?" Miss Marple asked. Blakely hesitated. "Not here." Miss Marple smiled faintly. That afternoon, Thomas Hensley's death was officially recorded as natural. The body was taken away quietly. The orchard reopened by the next day. But Miss Marple remained. She walked the rows alone, noting which trees bore signs of recent spraying and which did not. She observed the locked shed near the far fence and the way workers avoided its door. She noticed how often Mr. Blakely watched her, and how carefully he did not ask her to leave. In the village, conversation flowed easily, except when Thomas Hensley's name was mentioned. "He was difficult," someone said. "Always asking questions," said another. "Best not to dwell on it," concluded a third. Miss Marple listened and knitted. That evening, she placed the bitten apple on the table in her room and studied it once more. Thomas Hensley had not died from the orchard. He had died from something introduced into it. And poison, Miss Marple knew, was rarely administered without purpose. Someone at Briarcombe Orchard had wanted silence, and they had chosen a method that produced exactly that. Do you believe Thomas Hensley's death was a tragic accident, or the result of something far more deliberate? Share your theory below. What grows in the soil? Miss Marple had always believed that poison rarely began in bottles. It began in conversations. The day after Thomas Hensley's death, Briarcombe Orchard resumed its work with an eagerness that felt almost rehearsed. Ladders were propped against trees, baskets were filled, voices carried once more through the rows, though they never quite reached the place where Thomas had been found. Miss Marple noticed that too. She walked slowly along the edge of the orchard, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag, and observed how workers unconsciously adjusted their paths, how they bent away from the oldest tree, how their eyes flicked toward it and then away again. Avoidance, she knew, was rarely accidental. She stopped near a group of pickers and addressed a middle-aged woman whose hands moved quickly, almost aggressively, through the branches. "Thomas was very dedicated, I'm told," Miss Marple said gently. The woman's fingers paused for the briefest moment. "Too dedicated," she replied. "Always watching. Always asking why things were done a certain way." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Curiosity is rarely a fault." "In orchards," the woman said sharply. It can be. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on. Near the chemical shed at the far fence, she encountered Samuel Blakely for the first time. He was a lean young man with restless eyes and hands that never quite stilled. A faint chemical odor clung to his clothes despite the breeze. "You're Mr. Blakely's nephew," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Samuel looked wary. "Yes." "And you manage the treatments?" He nodded. "Been doing it for years." "Then you must know the orchard very well," Miss Marple said. Samuel shrugged. "I know what grows here." Miss Marple glanced toward the locked shed. "And what doesn't?" His jaw tightened. "Everything here is above board." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most things usually are, until they aren't." Samuel turned away without another word. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village shop. It was there, she knew, that opinions tended to ripen. "Such a shame about Thomas," the shopkeeper sighed. "But he brought trouble on himself." "How so?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "He was planning to go to the authorities," the woman whispered. "Said something about unsafe practices, chemical misuse." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "That seems quite serious." "Exactly," the shopkeeper said. "Could have shut the orchard down." "And did he tell anyone else?" Miss Marple asked. The woman hesitated. "His sister, I believe. She left the village years ago." Miss Marple made a note of that. That evening, she returned to the orchard alone. The shed door remained locked, but the ground around it told a different story. Fresh footprints, carelessly erased. Miss Marple bent and touched the soil lightly with her gloved fingers. It was damp. Recently disturbed. She straightened as Edwin Blakely approached, his expression carefully neutral. "You seem very interested in my orchard," he said. "It is quite fascinating," Miss Marple replied, "particularly how certain areas receive more attention than others." Blakely's smile did not reach his eyes. "We protect our livelihood." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but protection can sometimes look very much like concealment." Blakely's tone hardened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "I am observing." That night Miss Marple reviewed what she knew. Thomas Hensley had been dissatisfied, curious, concerned enough to consider involving authorities. He had access to the orchard daily and knew its rhythms, and he had eaten an apple, one that appeared no different from the rest, yet had ended his life quietly and efficiently. Poison, Miss Marple reflected, did not need drama. It needed opportunity. And opportunity in Briarcombe Orchard was plentiful. But poison also required intent. Someone had wanted Thomas Hensley silenced before he spoke, and as Miss Marple extinguished the lamp beside her bed, she knew the orchard's greatest danger was not what grew on its trees, but what had been allowed to grow in its silence. Do you believe Thomas Hensley was killed to protect the orchard, or to protect someone within it? Share your theory below. The bitter core. Miss Marple had often remarked that orchards, like villages, thrived on appearances. From a distance, Briarcombe looked prosperous and wholesome. Rows of fruit heavy with promise, workers moving in practiced harmony, baskets filling at a steady pace. But up close, the sweetness was uneven. Some apples bore blemishes carefully hidden on their shaded sides. Some trees received more care than others, And some truths, she suspected, were never meant to be tasted at all. She began the morning with a visit to the orchard's packing shed. Crates were stacked neatly, each marked with dates and destinations. Miss Marple ran a gloved finger along one label and paused. "Selective harvest," she murmured. A worker nearby stiffened. "Only the best go to market." "And the rest?" Miss Marple asked. "Used locally," the man replied. "Cider, preserves." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Or eaten straight from the tree." The worker flushed and turned away. Miss Marple noticed another detail then, one she had overlooked the day before. A small barrel tucked into the corner, marked not with a produce label, but with a faded chemical warning. "That's not usual storage," she remarked. Samuel Blakely appeared almost at once, as though summoned by her attention. "It's old," he said curtly. "Empty." Miss Marple looked inside. The barrel was not empty. A thin residue clung to the bottom, chalky, pale, and faintly crystalline. "You've been experimenting," Miss Marple said quietly. Samuel bristled. "I manage pest control. That's my job." "And Thomas Hensley questioned that management," Miss Marple replied. Samuel's jaw tightened. "He didn't understand." "He understood enough to consider reporting it," Miss Marple said. Samuel turned away abruptly. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the village records office, a modest room attached to the parish hall. There, she found something curious. A recent application submitted by Edwin Blakely, requesting approval for a new treatment compound. Denied. The margins bore notes citing health concerns and insufficient testing. Miss Marple folded the document carefully. That afternoon she encountered Mrs. Carter again near the orchard gate. "You knew Thomas well," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Carter sighed. "Too well. He talked about leaving. Said he'd rather be poor than complicit." "Complicit in what?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated. "In keeping quiet." Silence, Miss Marple reflected, always required maintenance. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the oldest tree, the one beneath which Thomas had fallen. She examined the surrounding soil carefully and noticed something odd. The grass here was thinner, paler, almost scorched in places. Chem runoff, perhaps. She knelt and scraped gently with the tip of her umbrella. Beneath the surface, the earth was faintly discolored. Miss Marple straightened slowly. If poison had been introduced here, not sprayed widely, but applied selectively, it would explain everything. One apple, one bite, one death that left no immediate trace. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not hear the footsteps behind her. "You shouldn't be here alone," Edwin Blakely said sharply. Miss Marple turned, unperturbed. "On the contrary, I find solitude most enlightening." Blakely's expression hardened. "This is private land." "And Thomas Hensley worked it," Miss Marple replied. "Until it killed him." "That is enough," Blakely snapped. "You are making dangerous assumptions." "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "I am making careful ones." Blakely leaned closer. "You don't understand how fragile this place is." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "I do. That is why poison was chosen. It preserves appearances." Blakely stepped back, his composure wavering. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, the bitten apple, now dried and shriveled, resting on a saucer beside her. Poison left no marks of struggle, no raised voices, no witnesses eager to speak. It relied instead on trust, on the belief that what looked wholesome must be safe. Thomas Hensley had bitten into that trust, and someone had made sure he never took another bite. But Miss Marple knew something else now. Poison rarely traveled far on its own. It was prepared, measured, applied by a steady hand that knew exactly what it was doing. And that hand, she suspected,
belonged to someone who believed the orchard could not survive without silence.
Do you think Thomas was poisoned deliberately through a single apple? Or was he exposed accidentally through wider chemical misuse? Share your theory below. The bottle in the hedge. Miss Marple had long ago learned that when people were determined to keep a secret, they often hid it too close to themselves. Briarcombe Orchard was no exception. The morning after her confrontation with Edwin Blakely, Miss Marple took a different path through the village, one that wound along the hedgerow bordering the orchard's northern edge. It was a narrow track, seldom used except by children and the occasional farmhand taking a shortcut home. Halfway along, she stopped. Something glinted faintly in the grass. Miss Marple bent with care and drew out a small glass bottle, corked and clouded with residue. Its label was partially torn away, but enough remained for her to recognize the warning markings. Not orchard spray, something stronger. She wrapped the bottle in her handkerchief and continued on as though nothing were amiss. Later that morning, she paid a visit to the village doctor, Dr. Leonard Finch, a brisk, practical man with a reputation for discretion. "I understand you examined Thomas Hensley," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Finch replied. "No signs of violence. Cardiac failure appeared likely." "And toxicology?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Finch hesitated. There was no reason to suspect poison. Miss Marple placed the wrapped bottle gently on his desk. "There is always a reason," she said softly. "When someone dies beneath a tree full of fruit and leaves an unfinished bite behind." Finch examined the bottle, his brow furrowing. "This compound," he said slowly, "is not used in agriculture. It's restricted." "Lethal?" Miss Marple asked. "In small doses, delayed," Finch replied. "It mimics natural failure." Miss Marple nodded. "Convenient." Finch looked troubled. "Where did you find this?" "In the hedge," Miss Marple replied, "where someone hoped it would be overlooked." Word of the bottle traveled faster than Miss Marple had expected. By afternoon, Samuel Blakely was furious. "You think I did this?" he snapped when Miss Marple encountered him near the shed. "Because I handle chemicals." "You are a very convenient suspect," Miss Marple agreed. "Young, defensive, and visible." Samuel stared at her. "Then who do you think did it?" Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she asked, "Who had access to compounds not meant for the orchard?" Samuel's anger faltered. "My uncle," he said reluctantly. "Edwin. He keeps supplies from before regulations tightened." "And Thomas knew this," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Samuel admitted. "He threatened to report it." "That does sound like motive," Miss Marple said gently. Samuel laughed bitterly. "Then why leave the bottle where it could be found?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "Because panic is not tidy." That evening, Miss Marple was visited by Mrs. Carter. "I saw him," the woman whispered, "the night before Thomas died." "Saw whom?" Miss Marple asked. "Samuel," Mrs. Carter said, "near the orchard, carrying something." Miss Marple tilted her head. Are you certain? Mrs. Carter hesitated.
It was dark. Yes, Miss Marple said kindly, and fear has a way of filling in details. By nightfall, suspicion had settled firmly on Samuel Blakely. Whispers spread quickly. Workers avoided him. Edwin Blakely remained strangely quiet, allowing the attention to fall elsewhere. Miss Marple, however, felt no satisfaction. The bottle had been hidden, not destroyed. The poison had been precise, not reckless. And the death had been quiet, not chaotic. This was not the work of an angry young man acting impulsively. It was the work of someone who understood timing, reputation, and the value of misdirection. Miss Marple returned once more to the oldest tree. Thomas Hensley had died here because someone knew he would eat that apple, knew his habits, knew his trust. And as Miss Marple looked out across the orchard, she realized something deeply unsettling. The most dangerous person in Briarcombe was not the one being accused. It was the one no one was watching. Do you believe the evidence against Samuel Blakely is genuine or carefully planted to protect someone else? Share your theory below. The weight of a convenient accusation. Miss Marple had always found that when suspicion settled too easily, it was usually because someone had carefully prepared the ground. By the 5th day after Thomas Hensley's death, the village had found its culprit, Samuel Blakely. It was spoken softly at first, shared looks, lowered voices, the kind of consensus that grew not from certainty, but from relief. A young man who handled chemicals, a temper not always well hidden, a visible connection to the means of death. Briarcombe Orchard wanted the matter finished. Miss Marple did not. She encountered Samuel near the packing shed that morning, where he worked alone now. The other workers had drifted elsewhere, leaving a wide, uncomfortable space around him. "You've been left to carry this alone," Miss Marple observed gently. Samuel's laugh was sharp. "Better me than the orchard, eh?" "Is that what you believe?" Miss Marple asked. "It's what they believe," he replied. "They've already decided." Miss Marple watched him carefully. His anger was real, but it lacked calculation. He was defensive, wounded, indignant, not careful. "Where were you the night Thomas died?" she asked. "At home," Samuel said immediately, "with my mother. She'll tell you." "And did anyone ask her?" Miss Marple said. Samuel hesitated. "No." That, Miss Marple reflected, was telling. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Samuel's mother, a quiet woman living in a small cottage near the orchard boundary. "He came home early that night," she said firmly. "Angry, yes, but he stayed." "Did he leave again?" Miss Marple asked. "No," the woman replied. "Not once." Miss Marple thanked her and left. An alibi untested was not an alibi ignored. It was an alibi deliberately avoided. Miss Marple returned to the orchard office where Edwin Blakely sat reviewing paperwork with exaggerated concentration. "The village seems quite convinced," Miss Marple remarked. Blakely did not look up. "They want answers." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And you've given them a very tidy one." Blakely's pen paused. "You think I am manipulating them?" "I think," Miss Marple said calmly, "that you are allowing them to believe what is most convenient." Blakely's smile was thin. "My nephew made mistakes." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not this one." She walked to the window and gestured toward the orchard. "Thomas Hensley trusted this place," she continued. "He ate an apple directly from the tree. That tells me he believed the orchard was safe.
And it was, Blakely snapped. "Except for one apple," Miss Marple said quietly. Silence followed. That evening, Miss Marple reviewed the timeline once more. Thomas worked early. He habitually tasted fruit from the oldest tree. The poison was delayed. The bottle was discarded where it would be found. And suspicion moved swiftly, too swiftly, toward the man best positioned to absorb it. This was not panic. This was planning. Miss Marple returned to the oldest tree just before sunset. She examined the branches again, this time not for fruit, but for signs of handling. On one low limb she noticed a faint smear, sticky, almost invisible, sap or something mixed with it. She touched it lightly with her glove and inhaled. Bitter. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The poison had not been applied to the ground or the orchard broadly. It had been painted. One apple, one branch, one death. That required patience, precision, and time. Miss Marple straightened slowly and looked toward the orchard house. Edwin Blakely had lived here all his life. He knew the trees intimately, their habits, their yields, their weaknesses. He knew Thomas's routines, and he had everything to lose if the orchard were shut down. More importantly, he had authority. People did not question Edwin Blakely. They deferred to him. They trusted him. Miss Marple folded her hands. Poison, she knew, was not chosen by the impulsive. It was chosen by those who wished to remain invisible. And the more the village focused on Samuel Blakely, the safer the real culprit became. Which meant Miss Marple would have to disturb that comfort soon. Do you think the village accused Samuel because the evidence was strong, or because it was easier to blame him than look elsewhere? Share your thoughts below. The hand that knew the tree. Miss Marple had always believed that people revealed themselves most clearly when they thought they were safe. At Briarcombe Orchard, Edwin Blakely felt very safe indeed. The village had settled comfortably into its chosen narrative. Samuel Blakely's isolation had grown complete. His presence now regarded as unfortunate but expected. Workers avoided him. Conversations fell silent when he approached. Even the constable's questions circled him with increasing focus, all of which suited Edwin Blakely perfectly. Miss Marple decided it was time to disturb that balance. She began by doing something very simple. She asked permission. Edwin Blakely was surprised when she approached him that afternoon, her manner as pleasant as ever. "I was hoping," she said, "that you might allow me to walk the orchard with you. You know it far better than anyone." Blakely hesitated, then smiled. "Of course. I've nothing to hide." They walked slowly among the trees, Blakely speaking fondly of yields and seasons, of storms weathered and blights prevented. Miss Marple listened carefully, not to what he said, but to how he said it. He knew every tree, not approximately, precisely. "This one produces early," he said, touching a branch lightly. "That one always ripens unevenly. And this," he added, pausing beneath the oldest tree, "has been the orchard's heart for decades." Miss Marple watched his hand as it rested briefly on the same low limb she had examined the night before. "You take great care," she observed. "One must," Blakely replied. "Carelessness spreads." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "So does poison." Blakely's hand stilled. "Pardon?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled. "Merely a figure of speech." They continued walking, but something had shifted. That evening Miss Marple paid a visit to the constable. "I believe," she said gently, "that you are pursuing the wrong man." The constable frowned. "The evidence,"
has been made to look helpful," Miss Marple interrupted, "which is precisely why it should trouble you." She laid out her reasoning calmly. The painted apple, the discarded bottle placed to be found, the untouched alibi of Samuel's mother, the convenience of blaming someone without authority. "The poison was not misused," Miss Marple concluded. "It was applied." The constable listened in silence. "And who," he asked finally, "would have the knowledge to do that?" Miss Marple did not answer aloud. Instead, she returned to the orchard at dawn. She stood beneath the oldest tree, basket in hand, as workers gathered nearby. Edwin Blakely noticed her at once. "You shouldn't be here alone," he called. "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "That's why I thought it best to do this publicly." She reached up and plucked an apple from the low branch. Blakely froze. "That one," he began. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "You're worried?" Blakely stepped forward sharply. "You don't know what has been applied to this branch?" Miss Marple finished. "I believe I do." She did not bite the apple. Instead, she placed it carefully into her basket. "You see," she continued calmly, "Thomas Hensley always tasted fruit before harvesting. He trusted this tree, and you knew that." Blakely's face had gone pale. "You couldn't poison the orchard," Miss Marple said. "That would risk discovery. But one apple? One trusted habit?" Silence spread through the gathered workers. "And when Thomas fell," Miss Marple continued, "you ensured the blame fell elsewhere, on someone younger, louder, easier." Blakely's composure cracked. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "He would have ruined everything." "Everything?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Except his life?" The constable stepped forward. "Edwin Blakely," he said, "you are under arrest." Blakely looked around the orchard, the trees, the workers, the low branch that had betrayed him. "It was necessary," he whispered. Miss Marple shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It was convenient." As Blakely was led away, Miss Marple looked once more at the apple resting in her basket. Poison had nearly succeeded, not because it was clever, but because it relied on silence. And silence, once broken, had a habit of echoing. "Do you believe Edwin Blakely acted alone, or was the village's silence just as responsible for Thomas Hensley's death? Share your thoughts below."
After the poison spoke. Miss Marple had always observed that the most uncomfortable moment in any village came after the culprit was named. Relief arrived first, then confusion, and finally a far more troubling emotion: recognition. Briarcombe Orchard did not erupt into noise when Edwin Blakely was taken away. There were no raised voices, no dramatic protests. Instead, the workers stood quietly among the trees, baskets hanging uselessly from their arms, as though the orchard itself had paused to listen. Samuel Blakely watched his uncle disappear down the path without speaking. Miss Marple stood beside him. "You were meant to carry this," she said gently. Samuel's voice was raw. I thought I was protecting him by staying quiet. Turns out I was protecting the wrong person." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Silence often chooses its beneficiaries." The constable began the slow, methodical work of collecting statements. It was then that the truth began to fray, not dramatically, but persistently. Mrs. Carter admitted she had seen Edwin near the oldest tree the night before Thomas Hensley died, brushing something onto a branch with careful strokes. "I didn't think it mattered," she said, wringing her hands. "He said it was to protect the fruit." Another worker recalled Edwin instructing them not to harvest from that tree the following morning. "I thought it was superstition," the man said quietly. Miss Marple listened without judgment. They had all assumed Edwin knew best. That afternoon, Dr. Finch confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. The compound found in the bottle would have lost potency quickly if exposed to air.
"It had to be applied shortly before ingestion," he said. "Direct contact." Miss Marple nodded. "Which means it was never accidental." As the formalities continued, Miss Marple walked once more through the orchard alone. Without Edwin Blakely's presence, the place felt subtly different, less controlled, less orderly. A few leaves lay uncollected, one ladder leaned where it had been left. Life, she reflected, had resumed its imperfections. She stopped beneath the oldest tree. The branch had already been pruned away, a clean cut, too clean. Samuel approached hesitantly. "I couldn't stand looking at it." Miss Marple understood. "Removing reminders does not remove responsibility," she said gently, "but it does allow healing." That evening, villagers gathered in the parish hall. The orchard's future was discussed in cautious tones: oversight, Inspections, shared management. For the first time, decisions were not deferred to a single voice. Miss Marple sat near the back, listening. Thomas Hensley's name was spoken openly now, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who had noticed what others chose not to. "He just wanted things to be safe," someone said. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "and safety requires honesty." Later, Samuel found her at the edge of the orchard. "I don't know if I can stay," he admitted. "Every tree reminds me." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Then remember this instead. The orchard survived because the truth was finally allowed to grow." Samuel nodded slowly. As night fell, Miss Marple returned to her room and placed the bitten apple, now fully desiccated, into her bag. She would turn it over to the authorities in the morning. Some evidence, she knew, carried meaning beyond proof. Thomas Hensley had trusted the orchard because he trusted the people who ran it. That trust had been abused, but it had also, in the end, exposed the poison hidden beneath years of careful silence. Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and sat in the darkness for a moment. Poison worked quietly. So did courage. And while one had nearly destroyed Briarcombe Orchard, the other had arrived just in time. Do you think Edwin Blakely's guilt absolves the village? Or does silence make everyone partly responsible? Share your thoughts below. When the trees are questioned. Miss Marple had always thought that confession was not the end of a mystery, but the beginning of its most difficult chapter. In Briarcombe, the arrest of Edwin Blakely settled nothing as neatly as the villagers had hoped. The orchard remained standing. The apples still ripened, but certainty, so long the village's most valued crop, had spoiled. The morning after Edwin's removal, inspectors arrived from the county. Their presence altered the orchard's rhythm at once. Clipboards replaced baskets. Questions replaced instructions. Workers who had once relied on habit were now asked to explain why things were done as they were. Miss Marple watched from the edge of the rows as one inspector paused beneath the oldest tree. "Why was this branch pruned so quickly?" he asked. Samuel Blakely hesitated. "Because it felt wrong to leave it." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured quietly. "Guilt often seeks tidiness." The inspector noted the response and moved on.
As the investigation widened, details emerged that no one had wanted to examine before. Old chemical invoices stored without labels.
Outdated compounds retained long past their approval. Informal decisions made on trust rather than verification. "These weren't crimes," the constable said later, sounding unsettled. "Just shortcuts."
"Shortcuts," Miss Marple replied gently, "are where accidents wait to be invited." The village gathered again that evening, this time not to speculate, but to decide. Without Edwin Blakely's authority, choices had to be made collectively. Who would manage the orchard? How would safety be ensured? Should Briarcombe continue at all? Voices trembled as people spoke, unused to being heard. "We trusted him," Mrs. Carter said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly from her seat near the wall. "And trust without oversight is merely hope." Silence followed, not defensive this time, but thoughtful. Samuel stood and addressed the room.
"I knew my uncle was cutting corners," he admitted. "I told myself it was necessary, that the orchard mattered more than procedure."
"And Thomas?" someone asked quietly.
Samuel swallowed. "Thomas believed the orchard mattered because people mattered."
The words lingered. Later, Miss Marple walked the orchard alone one final time. The rows seemed wider now, the space between trees less oppressive. Without a single will guiding every movement, the place breathed differently. She stopped near the spot where Thomas Hensley had fallen. The ground had been turned, replanted, fresh soil, dark and hopeful. Growth, Miss Marple reflected, requires disturbance. That night she packed her bag slowly. The village no longer needed her attention. The truth, once spoken aloud, had a way of continuing its work without supervision. Before retiring,
Miss Marple wrote a brief note to Thomas Hensley's sister, enclosing details of the investigation and a promise that his concerns had been heard at last. Some letters, she knew, arrived late, but late was better than never. Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and allowed herself a small, weary smile. Poison had been introduced quietly, patiently, with care. Undoing its effects would take just as long. But Briarcombe Orchard had finally learned the most difficult lesson of all, that unquestioned authority could be just as dangerous as neglect, and that sometimes the bravest act was not to speak loudly, but to stop staying silent. Do you think Briarcombe Orchard can truly change, or will old habits eventually return? Share your thoughts below. The taste that lingered. Miss Marple had always known that justice, once set in motion, rarely moved quickly, but it moved relentlessly. In the days following Edwin Blakely's arrest, Briarcombe Orchard existed in a state of uneasy suspension. The trees continued to bear fruit. The workers continued to arrive each morning. Yet nothing felt automatic anymore. Every action was considered, every habit questioned. The poison had not only claimed a life, it had altered the village's sense of certainty. Formal charges were prepared quietly. Inspectors returned with specialists, sealing the chemical shed and cataloging its contents with meticulous care. Dr. Finch's findings were confirmed. The compound used on the apple was restricted, its effects deliberately delayed, its application precise. "There was no accident here," the constable admitted to Miss Marple one afternoon. "No room for doubt." "No," Miss Marple replied. "Only room for regret." Samuel Blakely spent most of his time near the packing shed now, working longer hours than necessary. Guilt clung to him more stubbornly than suspicion ever had. "I should have spoken sooner," he said quietly when Miss Marple approached. "Yes,"
she replied gently. "But speaking too soon can be as difficult as speaking at all." Samuel nodded. "I told myself it wasn't my place." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "People often confuse authority with wisdom." That afternoon, Thomas Hensley's sister arrived in Briarcombe. She stood beneath the oldest tree, now pruned, its silhouette altered, and listened as the constable explained what had happened. "He always said something was wrong," she said softly. "They called him difficult." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And difficult people are often the most necessary." The sister knelt and placed a small marker where Thomas had fallen. Nothing ornate, just his name and the dates that framed his life. The village gathered quietly behind her. This time there were no excuses offered, only listening. Later, Miss Marple was invited to give a statement. She declined the formality but shared her observations in private. How Edwin Blakely's knowledge of the orchard had allowed him to apply poison without detection. How the false trail had been laid carefully to direct blame elsewhere, and how the village's silence had completed the act. "He did not act alone," she said calmly, "but he acted decisively." That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows through the orchard, Miss Marple walked once more among the trees. She plucked an apple at random, turned it in her hand, and then set it back on the branch. Trust, she reflected, once broken, took time to restore. But it could be restored. The orchard no longer felt complicit. It felt chastened. And chastened places, Miss Marple had learned, were capable of growth. As she returned to her lodging, Miss Marple packed her belongings carefully. Tomorrow she would leave Briarcombe behind. The poison had done its work. Now, so had the truth. And while Thomas Hensley's death could not be undone, its meaning no longer lay buried beneath politeness and fear. It lay exposed, sharp, bitter, and unforgettable. Just like the taste of the apple that had started it all. Do you believe regret is enough to change a community? Or does true justice require lasting accountability? Share your thoughts below. What the orchard learned. Miss Marple had always believed that places, like people, carried lessons within them, if one was willing to look beyond appearances. On the morning of her departure, Briarcombe Orchard lay quiet beneath a pale sky. The inspectors had gone. The constable's work was nearly finished. What remained was not procedure, but consequence. Miss Marple walked the rows slowly for the last time. Without Edwin Blakely's presence, the orchard felt less rigid, less controlled. Some trees leaned awkwardly, some baskets sat unfinished. Yet there was a sense of honesty in the disorder, a quiet admission that perfection had been an illusion all along. Inspector Hale met her near the packing shed. "Edwin Blakely has confessed," he said. "Fully." Miss Marple nodded. Confession is easier once silence has failed. "He admitted applying the poison himself," Hale continued. "Said Thomas Hensley forced his hand." "Yes," Miss Marple replied calmly. "People often blame the truth for exposing them." Samuel Blakely approached hesitantly, his hands stained with apple sap. "They're asking me to stay on," he said, "to help oversee things. Properly this time." "And what do you think?" Miss Marple asked. Samuel looked out across the orchard. "I think if I leave, nothing really changes." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then perhaps that is your answer." They stood together beneath the trees for a moment. "Thomas used to say the orchard didn't belong to one person," Samuel added quietly. "That it belonged to everyone who worked it." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And to everyone who depended on it being safe." Near the oldest tree,
Thomas Hensley's marker caught the light. Simple, unadorned, honest. Miss Marple paused there. Thomas had not been brave in grand ways. He had not made speeches or demanded attention. He had simply noticed something was wrong and refused to ignore it. In villages like Briarcombe, that was often the most dangerous thing a person could do. As Miss Marple returned to the gate, Mrs. Carter called after her. "I keep thinking," the woman said, "how close we all came to pretending it was nothing." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is how these things survive." Her train whistle sounded faintly in the distance. Miss Marple adjusted her coat and turned for one last look at the orchard. The apples still hung heavy on the branches. Life continued. But now, beneath the abundance, there was awareness. And awareness, Miss Marple knew, was the truest form of justice most places ever received. Do you believe Briarcombe Orchard will truly honor Thomas Hensley's sacrifice? Or will time soften its resolve? Share your final thoughts below. After the harvest. And so, dear listener, Briarcombe Orchard settles into a new season. The trees still bloom, the apples still ripen. To an outsider, little appears changed. But those who walk the rows now do so with different eyes that no longer mistake silence for safety. Thomas Hensley is gone, but his voice is not. It lives on in the questions that are finally being asked, in the procedures rewritten, and in the understanding that convenience must never come before conscience. Miss Marple leaves Briarcombe as she leaves all such places, quietly, without fanfare. Her work was never about accusation. It was about attention, about noticing the small, bitter details others were willing to swallow whole. Because poison rarely announces itself. It hides in trust. It thrives in silence. And it succeeds only when people look away. If this story lingered with you, consider why. Was it the method, the motive, or the unsettling truth that such crimes require very little cruelty, only permission? Thank you for sharing this mystery with me. If you found it compelling, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Which moment stayed with you the longest? Until our next story together, take care, and remember, when something tastes bitter where it should be sweet, it is always worth asking why.